The recent loss of Diane Katon, the immortal spirit of Hollywood, the lady who transformed vulnerability into art and solitude into a sublime kind of beauty, has left the film industry and millions of people around the world reeling. Her untimely death at 79 years of age sealed a triumphant chapter in cinematic history and pierced the very essence of art, leaving the entire globe in a state of stunned grief. The world looks on in silence as her family gets ready for an intimate goodbye in California, away from the limelight and cameras. Los Angeles is in the midst of a funeral. People are paying tribute from all around, although there is one voice that stands out among them. It is none other than Goldie Horn, Diane's co-star, confidant, and lifelong friend, whom she spent the joy and lightheartedness of her youth with, and now shares with her the weightiest of sorrows. While bidding farewell, Goldie caused an emotional meltdown, leaving everyone around her dumbfounded, and for millions that second became a universal anguish. As a small token of our appreciation to the woman who gave the world her whole being via her art and who has sadly been snatched from us by the hands of time, please hit like and write a goodbye message before we start. It is worth noting that the immortal spirit of Hollywood, Diane Keaton, began her career not with cheers but with silence, and that the world is mourning her loss. Embedded in her bones and casting a shadow over her dreams was a profound silence. Prior to her transformed her vulnerability into art, when still a young girl figuring out how to make it in a household where everyone smiled and kept their feelings disguised, where the last remnants of her mother's laughter filled the air as she grew up. Those formative years felt like a silent judgment on her soul, as if destiny was testing the limits of a legendary artist's resilience to isolation. She was born on January 5, 1946, in Los Angeles, California. She spent her childhood basking in the misleading light of Hollywood's golden skies, where being vulnerable was hidden like shame and perfection was twisted. Jack Hall, her father and a man of order, thought that regulations were a way to show affection. Dorothy Diane Katon, who was elected Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, had acting aspirations that eventually faded into home quiet. Before supper, everyone in the Hall household said grace, but no one spoke a word about how they felt. Laughter was meant for hosting parties, not mourning. When I was a kid, my family didn't talk much. Regarding her emotions, she would eventually admit, we were merely a part of them. Her entire body of work would revolve around that one statement, the quest that never ends in an effort to make the unspoken stand out. Diane saw, in the form of gradual surrender rather than catastrophe, the disintegration of her mother's dreams when she was a little girl. The clatter of dishes drowned out Dorothy's applause, and her reflection vanished, replaced by exhaustion. Diane, who was just 9 years old, stood in the doorway and watched as her mother's smile wavered between weariness and responsibility. What my mom wrote in her memoirs was that her life had been a cautionary tale rather than a roadmap. That knowledge, though, came to her like a prophecy, a stage, a script, and a light that might see her. These were Diane's dreams, unlike the 1950s dreams of white fences and secure forever homes. She was termed challenging by her teachers. Her classmates thought she was weird. Diane, however, was unbroken. She was standing up to the oppression of silence that had befallen women throughout history. Her subterranean insurgency was already raging, unseen to the naked view. A shaking spotlight brought her deliverance. She, too, quavered as Blanche Dubois in the school production. However, her trembling was caused by the truth, not fear, for the first time. The experience left an impression on her. Even after all these years had passed, performing wasn't acting. Everything revolved around staying alive. At the tender age of 21, she took a bus to New York City in 1966, cramming her mother's unfulfilled ambitions, her own pain, and her hunger into a single bag. In a move that may be seen as both defiance and atonement, she abandoned Hall and adopted Katon, her mother's maiden name. "Miss Katon's name is a way for people to remember my mom," she would whisper, as if her performances were a prayer to restore the time that had been taken from her. Even as the Ivy Kingdom grieves her demise, that promise echoes through the ages. The girl, who was unable to speak as a youngster, grew up to be the lady who found her strongest voice in times of quiet. Vulnerability, she told the world through her voice, is not a sign of weakness, but of art, of strength in its purest form, and of surrender not at all. Even in the middle of the raging mayhem of New York City, the stillness that had plagued her youth accompanied her. Winter loomed over Manhattan like a specter in 1966, bleak, never-ending, gnawing at flesh to its very core. At the tender age of 21, Diane disembarked from a Greyhound bus in Los Angeles bearing a single ragged bag, a pair of worn scripts, and the shaky bravery of an individual who would not disappear. She felt the truth, cruel, biting, and completely uncaring, in the first swoop of the city breeze. An Upper West tiny apartment was hers to find. The wallpaper is flaking off like long-forgotten regrets, and the pipes are making a half-lived sound. Instead of warming up, the radiator coughed, with the snow pressing against the cracked window and her breath rising softly like ghosts. She slept every night in her coat. The city glistened like promise from the outside. Beyond the exterior, the sound of non-existence was deafening. It turned out that New York wasn't a fantasy after all. It was a rite of passage. Being alive wasn't a matter of chance in this situation. As art, it was. The mornings were gloomy and icy. She was in line for auditions that never even started. Little rooms atop cafes filled with disappointment and smoke, excessively tall. Too odd. Not that kind. She felt as if the words were frozen in her flesh. She was working as a waitress by midday, and nobody had remembered her. She would perform her songs in haze-filled basements at night, which would irritate her throat. Despite her quivering voice, she stood tall and proud, the breaking of a heart's refusal to remain silent. Evenings during which she strolled in search of warmth while the wind howled through the alleys, unwilling to grovel or give up. On certain nights, she and another girl from the playhouse would divide a sandwich into 4 pieces and laugh until they bled, giggling at the ridiculous humor of being young, invisible, and alive. The radiator coughed instead of warming, but I stayed because I was afraid all the time, and fear became my engine. Her terror propelled her through weeks of famine and months of invisibility, as she would later describe. Tea and half a slice of bread, which she sliced so thinly, nearly disappeared, made up dinner. When the electricity went out, she wrote dialogue by candlelight, skipped the metro to save a nickel for coffee, and pawned her only good shoes to buy rent. In the midst of her anguish, she pushed her palms on the icy glass, seeking solace in its tangible presence. As she informed the shadows, not yet. And the shadows seemed to pay attention. Her shadow was loneliness. However, a light started to emanate from beneath it, an unassuming, unyielding flame. 2 years of rejection, famine, and near starvation later, in 1968, the call came. An unfiltered, terribly honest performer was sought after by the Broadway revival of Hair. Diane stomped in barefoot, shaking with fear, her belly empty of food yet brimming with vitality. She defied expectations for the very first time. Her performance was accompanied by Stay Alive. After 20 years of quiet, the director suddenly spoke out that night, telling the actors, "Don't change a thing." No one in the crowd saw flawlessness. Verdict was rendered. "I erected myself out of terror," she admitted later. It had no metaphorical depth. The topic was human anatomy. She was paralyzed with fear. Starvation is her driving force. Dismiss her instructor. Anxiety's her reflection. She learned to stand straighter with each no. Her wit became sharper with each unpaid bill. She forged the bravery that would come from every chilly night, establish her identity. This existed long before Annie Hall, The Godfather, and the world proclaimed her amazing. Despite the snow, a young woman carries nothing in her pockets. In the frigid darkness, her breath seemed like a ghost. Not to mention an ethereal being who defied the elements. There the myth was born. Not at ease, in the hushed applause that gave way to a resounding shout. A clap of thunder accompanied the initial camera flash. Diane Keaton stood momentarily awestruck and terrified beneath it, as if the radiant light that shone upon her might somehow engulf her. The name of the woman whose music could be heard on every American marquee had grown from that of a girl who had previously performed in a smoke-filled cellar for spare pennies. It all started with The Godfather. 1972 and beyond, this is where it all starts. She was the sole gentle spirit in a violent and powerful world, standing silently by Al Pacino's Michael Corleone as Kay Adams, Her fame was catapulted by the film. Because of that, she finally got a platform to advocate for since she was a little girl. Then, in 1977, Annie Hall arrived, and with it, eternal fame. The uncertain grin, the anxious. That became the fashion Bible. Those turtlenecks made me giggle. It was all just sitting there. Diane herself shone through, unfettered and radiant. It wasn't simply a woman on film that Hollywood saw. Imperfection encased reality was what it beheld. She felt like she had really made it when, that night, shivering under the bright lights, she clutched the Oscar. Standing alone in her kitchen, the statue shimmering next to an unfinished glass of wine, she whispered to the room that was deserted. "Is this what it's like to be the center of attention? Every spotlight has its own shadow," she would discover, and hers was lengthy and frigid. Fame appeared golden from a distance, yet it sliced like glass when examined closely. Perplexing, delicate, and perpetually prepared to inflict pain. A subtle menace accompanied each new script. Will it ever be the same for you? With her fingers smeared with ink and her eyes aching from the fluorescent light, she labored till daybreak. She committed lines to memory until they became hazy, added new dialogue that no one has requested, striving for an ideal that eluded her control time and time again. She admitted, "I didn't sleep," in retrospect. Quitting was terrifying. The cheers that had formerly elated her now rang out like alarms. She would occasionally drive through Los Angeles with the windows down, allowing the chilly air to blow through, smack her awake, attempting to recall the sensation of merely existing. "I believed that achieving success would complete me," she stated. "Perhaps all it did was give me the green light to publicly humiliate myself." Warren Beatty wanted everything when Reds came in 1981, and she gave it to him. The show was intense, raw, blistering, and brilliant. With a whisper, she recalled sobbing in the car following filming. Not due to the fact that, after the storm, there was a long period of quiet before the mid-1980s hit like a slow collapse. The Little Drummer Girl, 1984, ambitious but uneven, barely recouped half its budget. Critics praised her bravery, but she felt hollow, like a candle that had burned too brilliantly to survive its own flame. She turned down millions-dollar roles because she felt that fame without truth was a kind of failure, and the world that had once pursued her now passed her by. Hollywood grew cold and younger. Everyone thought she was still on top, but she was actually slipping. She disappeared from the screens not because she was losing, but to save herself. In spite of this, Diane resumed her usual method of working in the shadow of her own legend, writing, directing, and waiting. When a young actress once sought her advice on how to stay alive, Diane simply replied, "The applause fades. You are saved by the labor." Art transformed into prayer in that moment of isolation, rather than a means of validation or performance. The world adored Diane Keaton for her laughter. But the woman who built that laughter out of fear endured every sleepless night, every trembling hand, and every unspoken doubt. Greatness was never a crown for Keaton. It was a wound that had to be carried with grace. Diane Keaton learned that light burns, that resilience is not noise but breath, and that beauty bruises. Her greatest achievement, though, was in the unseen times. The 3 o'clock rewrites, the silent sobs in the makeup trailer, the bravery to be present when everyone else had already moved on, and the roles that will live on in history, even though history will remember the Oscars, the red carpets and the iconic roles. Years later, on the set of The First Wives Club, she met Goldie Horn, and laughter ensued. It wasn't the camera-demanded kind, but the kind that heals. The silence that had once tormented her no longer hurt. It listened and forgave. It's tragic to think that the laughter that used to fill entire film sets now echoes only in memory. The world came to a standstill when news of Diane Keaton's death at 79 broke. However, the subsequent quiet was intolerable for Goldie Horn. The call had come while she stood on the veranda of her Pacific Palisades home, and for an instant she froze. Below her, the ocean shimmered, and the wind rustled the palm trees, but her heart would not comprehend. "No, not Diane," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice cracked like glass. A week prior, they had conversed over the phone, joking, laughing, and discussing anything and everything. Diane had made fun of her hat collection and the idea that aging was simply a performance. Then her tone softened, and she had said, "Promise me you'll keep laughing." Goldie had laughed back, mistaking Diane's words for something else entirely. Now all she had was that echo, the final words of a woman who had transformed silence into music. It was a headline for the world, but for Goldie, it marked the end of a chapter filled with light, trust, and a sisterhood that only two women who had endured the brutality of Hollywood could comprehend. "We promised we'd grow old together," she whispered through her tears. And somehow they did. Their story started almost 30 years earlier in 1996, on the set of the First Wives Club. Diane was 50 years old. Quiet and thoughtful, Diane was punctual, with script pages marked in pencil and her wardrobe in order. Goldie, on the other hand, would float in minutes before a take, her laughter lingering like perfume. Diane exuded discipline and quiet grace, while Goldie was pure sunshine, effervescent, unfiltered, and brimming with joy. On a chilly New York street, Goldie noticed Diane quivering in her chair and threw her own coat over her shoulders. "You're always the strong one," she whispered. "Let someone else carry it for a while." They were no longer co-workers. From that night on, they were co-conspirators against loneliness. Diane smiled, a tiny, rare smile that shattered her armor. Goldie, with her golden glow, carried her own ghosts, doubts about aging, fading fame, and the brutal honesty of a mirror that never lies. She saw through all of it. Diane, still wrestling with her lifelong fear of not being enough, found a mirror that didn't judge in Goldie. Behind the glamour of the First Wives Club, the jokes, the perfect hair, and the champagne were two women quietly saving each other. "Diane made me feel safe being human," the speaker stated. A sacred bond developed between them over the years as they whispered confessions about heartbreak and the strange emptiness of success between takes. They laughed until their eyes welled up with tears and sobbed over things neither could fix. Their hands lingered together as the director called cut, as if they both knew the real performance was happening off camera. After dinners that went on till sunrise, birthday calls that ended in laughter and lengthy silences that never required words, Goldie adored Diane's bravery, and Diane admired her joy. Diane once said that Goldie carried light armor, and she taught me to breathe again. In a world consumed by competition, they opted for tenderness. At a dinner in Malibu, Diane raised her glass and whispered, "To the woman who reminded me that laughter can be a type of prayer." When the accolades came, we celebrated each other's achievements. When the disappointments came, we retreated to the kitchens with wine and wordless solace. Gold's sorrow at the loss of Diane Keaton was quiet, but it was palpable. At the standing near the front of the memorial in Los Angeles, she held a solitary white rose in her fragile fingers. She struggled to let go of it, but her body refused to acknowledge what her heart knew. Her voice cracked into a whisper as she finally spoke. Diane was more than just funny. She was courageous. Some people sobbed openly while others bowed their heads. Even Hollywood, the kingdom of performance, bowed before something purer, unconditional love. Goldie stayed after the ceremony ended. She was the sister I never had. The silence she leaves behind is deafening. She placed the rose next to the portrait and reached out, her fingertips brushing the glass. "I'll keep laughing for both of us," she whispered. Then she turned, her reflection caught in the frame. "One woman illuminated by two lives intertwined," she said. The light outside had turned a soft gold color long after the cameras had gone. Diane's hair had been the same hue under the studio lamps years ago, and on occasion, in the stillness just before sunrise, she claims to hear it. That distinctive laugh whispering through the darkness like sunlight breaking through clouds. She never looks, just smiles. Some noises never really go away. Maybe that is how Diane Keaton would have wanted to be remembered, not as a frozen icon, but as a real person. The friend who left behind a laughter that refuses to die has returned, and with it the silence that haunted her. However, this time, the silence isn't lonely. Rather, it is filled with echoes and love. If Goldie Horn's and her millions of fans' grief felt like slow-motion heartbreak, then Diane Keaton's family's grief was invisible, an ache that lingered in the quiet. When the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds dispersed, her Los Angeles, there was complete silence in Angelus's house. By the door hung the hats she had worn on each set. Her reading glasses were open next to a chilly cup of tea. Her favorite chair by the window remained unmoved, with a blanket covering its arm. The jacaranda trees outside swayed gently, sending purple petals into the driveway as if nature were in mourning. Dexter, Angelus's daughter, whispered to her brother, "It feels like the house is holding its breath." The world saw Diane Katon as a movie legend and icon, but to Dexter and Duke, she was more like a mother who kissed them on the forehead and whispered prayers they could only hear. In that hushed stillness, grief settled like dust, invisible and inescapable everywhere. Diane Katon burned every slice of toast, sang off-key in the kitchen, loved too loudly and apologized too quickly, and tucked them in at night. A small cry in the dark. A baby girl who didn't share her blood, but somehow shared her heartbeat. Diane had adopted Dexter in 1996 at the age of 50, when her career was thriving, but her soul was starving for something real. The applause was deafening, yet her nights were unbearably quiet. A silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself. She had expressed her fear of being alone indefinitely, but after her arrival, everything became clear. The little girl had saved her. Diane had to learn motherhood the hard way, through tears and sleepless nights, laughing and crying equally. 5 years later, she welcomed Duke, a gentle boy whose laughter lit up the house. "He made me brave again," she told a friend. The two of them became a strong team. The three of them persevered through mornings of burnt toast and scribbled messages on mirrors that said, "You're doing great," creating a house that was imperfect but sturdy. Every day she taught them that family isn't about matching DNA, but about choosing each other. "She didn't simply raise us," Dexter once said. "She taught them movie evenings wrapped in blankets, vows whispered in the dark." Diane remained the center of gravity for nearly 30 years, through the storms of Duke's adolescence and Dexter's wedding. She was delicate, fierce, and endlessly human. She was also everything gentle, as Duke whispered. At midnight, she would call me and ask if I would, after eating, I would call her in the morning to confirm that she still loved me. However, today the phone remained silent and the mirror notes had ceased. In her studio, the camera she had used before remained by the window, facing the garden, capturing a final shot of sunlight that she never had the chance to print. Dexter occasionally walks past it, afraid to touch it, as if pressing the shutter might cause the light to escape. Diane Keaton washer. Children felt her presence as the fragile warmth that made the silence bearable. Now, that warmth has left them. On certain nights, as the wind whispers through the jacarandas, it sounds almost like her laughter, faint, fleeting, but stubbornly refusing to fade. For some loves, unlike life itself, they do not end when death does. Diane had always hidden her pain behind light. In those last weeks, the light flickered but never went out. After the wildfires tore through Los Angeles, destroying part of her home, she retreated to Palm Springs. But Carol Bayer Sager, the songwriter, confidant, and one of the last to hold her gaze, was the first to understand what was happening. Diane had lost so much weight, Carol whispered, her voice breaking, but she never stopped smiling. Her home was a haven of calm, sunshine, and solitude. The desert served as her spiritual center, and she would begin each day by walking barefoot on the cool tile floors, camera in hand, in search of what she referred to as little miracles, such as the reflection of a palm leaf on stucco, the shimmer of dust in a sunbeam, or the swoosh of a bird's wings as they dipped below the horizon. "I'm exhausted," Carol whispered as she muttered under her breath. However, she persisted in creating even as her physical strength dwindled. The unpublished and anonymous photographs she left behind serve as her last journal, with each frame serving as a gentle farewell. It was as though she had always known the truth that she had spent her life sharing with others, that art was the sole means of leaving a lasting legacy. Hollywood froze when the news of her passing broke on October 11th, 2025. Reese Witherspoon said, "She showed us that beauty is courage, not symmetry." while Leonardo DiCaprio praised her brave honesty and human form in a post. Jane Fonda's trembling voice on live television was just one example of the many tributes that poured in from all corners of the globe. Anxious admirers congregated outside her house in Los Angeles. "You gave me the courage to be myself." A single note written in blue ink fluttered in the breeze. On the other side of the ocean, theaters turned down the lights before late-night screenings of Annie Hall. And in Palm Springs, some laid lilies, her favorite. Others left her wide-brimmed hats lined up like silent sentinels guarding the gate. In Springs, on the edge of the desert where she had spent her last months, a small gathering gathered at sunset. There were no speeches, no tears, just the gentle whisper of wind that had caressed her skin in those last days. For an instant, it seemed as though her laughter had been carried back on the wind. Diane Katon's death was the end of Hollywood's golden heartbeat. But to her, it had been just the opposite. Her death defied disappearance, even in death. Her spirit lingers in the camera by the window, still pointed toward the garden, in the stack of hats by the door, in the smell of cedar and perfume that refuses to leave her empty chair. Maybe most importantly, she lives in the millions she unknowingly saved those who saw her. For her family, it was the collapse of their center, and for her friends, it was the disappearance of the one person who could make silence feel holy, and at last glimpsed themselves. Her laughter, luminous and obstinate, continues to float through the world she departed from, unwavering. Some lights go out, but hers did not. It merely learned to burn in a different way, gentler, deeper, everlasting. Some legends captivate, and then through her kindness, courage, and light, Diane Katon was able to conquer Hollywood, not by fitting in, but by daring not to. In a world that worships perfection, she made imperfection radiant. In an industry that worshipped perfection, she quietly redefined what it means to live. Sameness. She transformed authenticity into art. Underneath each hat, smile, and trembling paws that swayed between laughter and heartbreak, resided a woman who boldly refused to let fear control her narrative. Through her vulnerability, she taught the world that it is not weakness, but a sacred form of strength. Her laughter was a form of rebellion, and her silence a form of prayer. Through her art, she transformed aging into poetry, loneliness into art, and heartbreak into a kind of grace. She mentioned that she never sought to stand out since she simply didn't know how to fit in. That was her subtle rebellion, the truth that she held aloft through decades of deceit. She never put on a show to win over others. She did it to stay alive. And by doing so, she allowed the rest of us to be ourselves. Not only did Annie Hall teach us that endings don't erase beauty, but she also served as a compass for her peers, who she reminded that fame without integrity is just noise, and as a permission for her fans, who had waited their whole lives for her, to age without apology, to falter without shame, and to love without perfection. Her films didn't just entertain, they healed. The movie Something's Gotta Give taught us that love isn't reserved for the young. It belongs to the courageous who have faith. Off-screen, she was even more remarkable. She entered rooms without making a fuss, and she made them bigger just by being herself. Actresses in her younger years said that she made them feel noticed, and crew members said that she always remembered their photographers remembered her tilting her head and whispering, "Let's make something honest," while friends said she never departed without thanking them. Instead of chasing youth, she turned time into her ally. Her eccentricities were not hidden, but rather worn proudly. In doing so, she reimagined beauty as authenticity rather than symmetry. Diane Keaton proved to generations of women who were told they needed to be quieter, smaller, and easier to love, that the only way to survive was to expand, laugh, and dare. Her legacy isn't written in plaques or awards. It lives on in every woman who dares to live unannounced, to transform fear into art, and to find holiness in imperfection. Now, as the world pauses in her absence, maybe the best tribute isn't applause, but silence, the kind she loved. The kind where reflection resides. Even though her Hollywood star faded, her gentle, unfading light shines on through Palm Springs, her photographs and the laughter she shared with Goldie Horn, which reverberates through the ages. Somewhere, that same laughter floats between realms, the the sound of two spirits who transformed friendship into a haven, humor into a means of survival, and art into a form of prayer. As Diane once put it, art is forgiving the world for breaking your heart. We should remember her not with tears, but with laughter, the laughter she gave us, the kind that is both fierce and fragile, the kind that carries light into the darkness. Perhaps that was her whole purpose, to teach us to live gently in a world that isn't. Tonight, as we whisper her name, let us laugh instead. Diane, rest easy. You brought beauty out of fear, music from quiet, and art from time. If her light ever shone into your life, leave a heart, a memory, or just her name. The world will always be brighter because of her. And the echo of her laughter, that trembling sound of truth, will never fade.